Hey everyone, I'm Aaron from Finctum Languages, and in this video, I just wanted to give you a slightly deeper look at a blog article I wrote this week called The Great Myth of Language Learning, the Grammar Trap. And this is a post that I made on Patreon. Normally, it's only visible to my patrons, but for the purpose of this video, I decided I would just share it with all of you. Before I go any further, though, I want to say a big shout out to all of the people who have supported me on Patreon. That's Ian, Susan, Hillary, JP, Brian, and Nathan. I appreciate all the support that you guys have shown my channel. And if anyone else is interested in supporting my channel, you can go to my Patreon page and find various tiers that you can use to support my channel in exchange for benefits like private lessons with me, and other things like access to my blog feed and the different articles that I've written on there over the past months. So there's that if you're interested. Anyways, let's get into the great myth of language learning. I'm just going to read through this article and just explain some things that have been sort of on my mind lately. So anyways, confession time. It's a bit frustrating when I try so hard to help people discover the most effective ways to learn a new language, and they always insist on sticking to the old methods that are proven to fail. Let me ask you this. How many people do you know who had to take language classes in school? And what percentage of those people are now fluent in the language? If you live in the United States like me, that number is probably something close to 0%. The old grammar-based methods of teaching languages are great if the goal is to prepare students for their final exam, but terrible if the goal is to prepare students for real-life conversations in the language. The fact is, we simply don't have time to run through rules from a textbook silently in our heads while we're trying to converse. So the grammar-based method of learning just doesn't work. And believe it or not, this is good news. This is something I say all the time on my channel. You can't learn languages just by reading a textbook, right? It takes muscle memory. You can't learn to swim. I've mentioned this later in the article. You can't learn to swim by reading a textbook. You got to swim. You can't learn to play guitar by reading a book about how to play guitar. You got to practice, get that muscle memory in there. Okay, and what I'm saying here is that this is good news. Well, why is it good news? It's because you don't have to delay gratification. I guess I'll get into that here in just a second. Nobody wants to spend time slaving away over a dusty old textbook or notes from class. We don't eagerly look forward to being able to spend our evenings at a desk working through verb conjugations. The good news is that you don't have to delay gratification. You can say goodbye to those boring methods that don't work and start some much more fun and exciting rituals that will yield much better results faster. In my new video series titled Finally Learn That Language, I outlined 3 important principles that any language routine must take seriously in order to get the results we're all looking for. I want to go into a bit more detail about these 3 principles here. Okay. And the reason I wanted to, the whole reason I posted this is because I got into, not a fight, but I just had some haters on my channel, and also other people that I had a bit of a confrontation with on Reddit as well. People who saw my video and they were like, you know, they see that the first point here is don't study grammar, practice using the language. And they think, well, really? The secret to learning a new language is practicing a lot? Like practicing is your big secret? This is clickbait. And if that's the point that you took out of the video, then, well, I guess it's my fault. Maybe I didn't do a very good job of clarifying the point that I was making in this video. But if that's what you took out of the video, then you didn't understand. Okay, there is a huge misconception. I call it, you know, the great myth of language learning, that all you have to do in order to learn a language is to be diligent and study grammar. and, work through your textbook, do all the exercises in your workbook, do your homework for your Spanish class every day, and then you will know Spanish. Okay. This is common. It's common for people to think this, or otherwise they think if I just make it to the end of doing all my Duolingo exercises, then I will be able to speak Spanish. And it's just not true. That's why my first point here is don't study grammar. Practice using the language. You can't learn to swim by reading a book, and you can't learn to speak languages that way either. Developing new skills means developing muscle memory. And that only happens when you actively practice using the skills you're trying to acquire. For languages, that usually means speaking, listening, reading, and writing, not exercises in a workbook. Now, when I say using the language, I mean doing any activity in which you call on your knowledge of the language in order to accomplish something that you want to do. That could mean holding a conversation, reading a story, watching a TV show, listening to music or a podcast, texting a friend, posting on Reddit, writing poetry, or any number of other activities. But they should be activities that you want to do, okay? That doesn't include things like grammar drills, flashcards, or reading a textbook. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying don't use flashcards. I'm not saying throw out your textbook, okay? This is not the Dead Poet Society. I'm not saying don't go to class. I'm not saying don't do your homework, okay? These activities are all okay, but they shouldn't be the focus of your language development plan, okay? It's not that a textbook is going to hurt your ability to speak a language. It's just not going to help that much, okay? What you need to be focusing on is using the language. Of course, if you do no formal study, you will not be able to speak correctly right away. But the more you use the language, correctly or otherwise, the more your ability to speak it will begin to line up with the way that native speakers talk. It won't happen overnight, but it is a lot faster than waiting to speak until after you already know all the rules of the language. And I bring this up because I just talked to someone on Reddit yesterday who said they saw my video and they said I was wrong. They said, I just read through a whole grammar book in German, and now I'm ready to start trying to start speaking the language. And I'm like, you went through a whole book and you didn't even try to speak at all that whole time? And they're like, yeah, now I have a good basis to go off of so I can start learning the language. And I'm like, that just seems so boring. And, if it works for you, more power to you. But I don't have the patience to make it through a whole book. Not only that, but if I just read through the book and I'm not actively using what the book says, by the time I get to chapter 3, I've already forgotten what's in chapter 2. So I always recommend using the language rather than studying it. And by studying, I mean studying grammar rules. But use the language in real situations like conversations, text messages with friends, post something online on Instagram, on Twitter, on Reddit. Use the language in those scenarios. And in the meantime, you can lean on step 2. Don't stress about the mistakes you make. And this is really important. I think people underestimate this a lot. But so many people are terrified to use their language skills because they're afraid they might mess up. And hey, I get it. Speaking a foreign language can be intimidating, especially if you're talking to a native speaker. But truly maximizing your language learning potential with step 1 requires a change of mindset, right? Rather than hoping you can get through a conversation without making any mistakes, try going into the interaction with this mindset. And this is what you have to say to yourself. This is what you have to psych yourself up towards. My language skills are nowhere near good enough to make it through this conversation without error. And that's okay, because I will still make it through. I'm going to make tons of mistakes in this conversation, and I don't care. I will use this language to the best of my abilities. And when my abilities fall short, I will make myself understood by any means necessary. I will not focus on or apologize for my mistakes. I will focus instead on the successful communication that I am going to achieve. Then, in my next conversation, I will speak even more confidently. If you go into a conversation with this frame of mind, nothing will stop you from practicing. And then nothing will stop you from learning your target language. Okay. But I talk to so many people who are just terrified of using the language because they don't know exactly how to use it correctly all the time. And that's just this huge stumbling block that can be so easily avoided if you just adopt the mindset in step 2. Then number 3, take in lots of input. And for more about this, you can read anything by Stephen Krashen, but I'll get to that later. The 2 methods of receiving input are reading and listening. And obviously output would then be speaking and writing. And some research suggests that doing a lot of these 2 activities may be the single most productive thing you can do to help yourself progress in your target language. You can't be engaged in conversation with a native speaker 24 hours a day, but you can almost always be listening to something in your target language. You can soak your brain in the language practically nonstop. The 2 stipulations on this are that the input you consume should be 1, comprehensible, and 2, compelling. All that means is that you should be able to understand the majority of what you're reading or listening to, and that it should be able to hold your interest based solely on the content alone. If you don't understand the majority of what you're taking in, or if it doesn't hold your interest, move on to something else that does. Okay, and the beauty of this is that it's something that's fun, it's enjoyable, it's not delayed gratification like working through an entire textbook. It's something that you want to do right now and something that you would be doing anyways, even if you weren't learning a language. You would just be doing it in your native language. Obviously, that's really hard to do up front when you're a beginner, but if you start doing it step by step, little by little, reading something easy at first and then working your way up to more advanced books and audio, it'll just become so natural, and your ability to use the language will it'll be just very natural, very similar to the way that native speakers speak, because you're taking in so much of the way that they speak. All right, where did I leave off here? If you don't understand the majority of what you're taking in, or if it doesn't hold your interest, move on to something else that does. For more information on this, read anything by the researcher Stephen Krashen. And of course, he was the one who made famous the theory of comprehensible inputs. And that input should be comprehensible and compelling. So that's my blog post on Patreon. Again, if you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, you can do so here in exchange for private lessons and just different perks depending on what tier you choose. Anyways, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Now go into the world and learn that language.